to Feminism Today, everyone. I'm Sophia Johnson in New York. Protests erupted in Tehran in the days after Masha Amini's death. The 22-year-old woman was detained by police for improper wearing of a headscarf. She died in police custody, and there's since been unrest in many places around the world. For more on this, we're joined now by Pardis Mahdavi, an Iranian American who is provost of the University of Montana and author of the book Passionate Uprisings, Iran's Sexual Revolution. She's also author of the recently published Washington Post op-ed, When Iran's Morality Police Came for Me. Professor Mahdavi, welcome to Feminism Today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
So thanks again for joining us at this very intense moment and potential turning point in Iran's history. State media today says a little over 47 people have been killed, including protesters and police. The BBC quotes a human rights group saying more than 80 protesters have been killed. What do you know about where things are in Iran as of this moment?
Great question. Thanks so much. What we're seeing today in Iran are widespread protests. Unlike what we've seen in the last decade or two, the protests have spread to over 50 cities in Iran, with women and men out in the streets protesting, young and old, people of a variety of socioeconomic classes. And we see these protesters coming out, speaking very courageously and boldly against a regime that they feel does not represent them and that actually is repressing their human rights.
All this it seems to fall very nicely into your recently published book. And I wonder if we could sort of reach into the key findings in this book to sort of speak more about what is happening and what we see spilling over into the streets. Now, Passionate Uprisings is a fascinating, groundbreaking, and really a personal look at society that is poorly understood, if it is understood at all by Westerners. The narrative provides not only an invaluable insight into the real lives of much of Iran's population, but also shows how sexual politics and the youth culture could, in fact, destabilize the current regime. There's a real possibility of that. What was your intention? And secondly, what did the critics in Iran get right or wrong about your book?
So, I think my intention was really to describe a burgeoning youth movement that I was watching unfold in Iran. So, to fully answer your question, Sophia, we have to go back to the revolution. The Iranian Revolution of 1978, 1979 resulted in an ousting of the monarchy, the Shah, and then the Islamists came to power. And under Ayatollah Khomeini, the Islamists came to power under a fabric of morality. It was this idea that Iran had become overly infatuated with the West, or what we might call West-toxicated. Mm-hmm. So this regime came to power promising to restore Iran to an old sort of Iranianness. And they really operationalized their power. They exercised their power through this morality. Now, young people born during and after the revolution, what we call children of the revolution, they were born into this regime and did not necessarily agree with the way in which the regime operated. Mm-hmm. And so they sought to attack the regime. They sought to resist and speak back against the regime through using their bodies. They were trying to attack the regime by attacking that fabric of morality. Mm-hmm. And so that's why they engaged in what they called Iran's sexual revolution. It was really about using their bodies. And again, I'm so honored to be speaking about this with you today, because these are absolutely pages borrowed from the feminist playbook, right? The personal is political, the body is political. And these young people were risking their lives and are risking their lives to speak back to the regime. Yeah. You asked a question about, my book and how it was received. Well, unsurprisingly, it was not received well by the authorities. Yeah. That said, my research under President Khatami, who was a more moderate president, I did have support to do the work I was doing, because I was also looking at issues around sex education, HIV, AIDS, etc. Mm-hmm. But once a hardliner, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, was elected and came to power, at that point, I was seen as a threat to the state.
Can we talk a little bit more about the morality police, sort of the heart of sort of what we see spilling over in the media? And in some ways, I wonder if it's really the context of this discussion is really understood. For many Iranian women, for example, we see images sort of all over the world, women cutting their hair, a sign of beauty. The demonstrators gather around burning barricades and also, really trying to push back on what really happened to Masha Amini. What has been the history of Iran's morality police with women?
Yep. So the morality police were created, like I said, by the Islamist regime, who created several different arms of the police force. So one is the Revolutionary Guard. That's the arm of the police force that people outside of Iran are more familiar with. The morality police, or guidance patrol, were charged with upholding right and forbidding wrong. Now, Sophia, you and I know how you enforce that, how you interpret that is going to be, up for some debate.
Sure.
They were charged with walking the streets of Iran to ensure that all Iranian citizens were embodying proper morality, were quote unquote right. So in some cases that meant their outerwear. So for women, it meant that the headscarf had to be so tight that it only showed the oval part of the face. No hair could be shown.
Wow.
For men, it meant eye-catching hairstyles or eye-catching accessories were prohibited. They were also, however, looking at behavior. So young men and women, for instance, holding hands, an unmarried couple kissing or holding hands in the park, that would be considered immoral behavior. And they would be subject to being rounded up and being arrested.
Now, there's obviously been some time since the morality police became institutionalized. Why do you think Masha Amini's death has become, in this way, has become such a powerful symbol of defiance in Iran and around the world? Has this been a long time coming? What's your sense of this?
I think it has been a long time coming. I think that there have been protests. And, I began my research on what, young people called Iran's sexual revolution. I began that work in the late 90s and early 2000s. So even since then, people have been out in the street. They have been out there using their bodies to speak back. We've seen waves of protest. 2009 was the Green Movement.
Right.
Saw a series of waves in 2017, 2018, 2019. So, the momentum has been building. And with each subsequent protest, you see more and more people involved. It spreads to more and more cities. You see different kinds of Iranians involved in this. And, I think your question about Mahsa Amini is a really good one, Sophia, because, this was the death of an innocent. And it's not that dissimilar from, the brutal murder of George Floyd, captured on film as a call to action, catalyzing call to action, that really ignited a movement of people who have had enough, and they're saying enough is enough.
Now, tell us a little bit about your story. How did you end up in Iran for your doctoral research?
So I'm Iranian American. My parents came during the revolution. I am one of those children of the revolution. So I would have been born in Iran had it not been for the revolution. I was born here and have always sort of grown up living life betwixt and between, right? To Iranian in America, to American in Iran. And I became really interested. I was studying gender, human rights, and feminism as an undergraduate, and then in graduate school when I was looking at this question of gender and Islam, right? And how do we understand feminism in a Middle Eastern context? And how do we reconcile the different types of feminisms? And so I went to Iran initially to follow the feminist movement in Iran. And when I arrived in Tehran for the first time in 1999, one of the things that really inspired me was that young people my age, they were certainly engaged in feminist movements, plural, but what they were most passionate about was this sexual revolution that they were engaging in. And I was shocked because this was not something that anyone had read about or talked about outside of Iran. And so I felt, really compelled to tell their story and to amplify their voices worldwide.
Now, I read in your op-ed, if you could fast forward a little bit, that you were shut down from presenting the key findings in your dissertation research during a lecture, 13 minutes into your lecture. Can we talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a painful experience.
Mhm.
But I think it is important to talk about. I think so many of us are now feeling called to speak about what happened to us over the past, 2 decades because of what we're seeing on the streets. We're feeling more empowered.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
in my case, I was absolutely presenting the results of my field work. My friends, my colleagues in Iran, they were quite adamant that I present my findings in Iran first, which absolutely made a lot of sense to me. Folks had risked their lives to speak with me and to be a part of my research. The least I could do was to present it in Iran. And
Mhm.
so I was there doing a lecture on Iran's sexual revolution there in Tehran. And 13 minutes into my lecture, the auditorium doors banged open, and roughly a dozen members of the morality police came
Mhm.
stomping in, and chaos and pandemonium erupted. And I should have been shredding my lecture notes, but I was frozen to the podium, just
Right,
gripping with both hands,
right.
and almost watched in a state of suspended animation, two members of the morality police walk up the 4 stairs to the lecture stage
Yeah.
and grab me, and then I blacked out.
So I read also in the same op-ed that they accused you of trying to foment a revolution. What was what was carried? Was this heard in the trial? What really happened after that unconscious experience? Were you knocked unconscious, or you really don't know? And can we talk a little bit about fomenting revolution? What does that mean? What did they take you for?
Yeah, one of the accusations leveled against me was fomenting a velvet revolution, and I was accused of, because I had been writing about the sexual revolution, which was, a form of resistance that sought to peacefully overthrow the regime. I was accused of being a ringleader or being a part of that.
Mhm.
I also had an accusation of being also overly West toxicated, given that I had been educated in the West, and it
Mhm.
was this idea that I was bringing certain Western ideas of resistance, etc. Even though it was quite the opposite. I was documenting this very organic and powerful movement that had risen up on the streets of Iran.
Mhm.
I had the accusations leveled against me, but I did not go to trial. I was one of the lucky ones.
I see. So you just were deported?
I was eventually, 33 days later, I was kicked out, stripped of my Iranian citizenship, and exiled from my ancestral homeland.
Right. So, what do you expect that there's any sort of risk associated with you talking about this publicly now, or this pretty much been settled?
I don't know if these are ever settled. I think anyone, I think I was incredibly inspired listening to Masih Ali-Nejad on Bill Maher last night. I think anyone speaking out right now is incredibly brave, is incredibly courageous. And at
Right.
the same time, I think we all have a duty to support the courageous men and women who are risking their lives on the streets of Iran today.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I mean, I've been watching all the images, and I really have a sense of concern in terms of the aggressive police response to the people, the brave men and women, young people who are really trying to stand up for change. And so I wonder where do you see this going? What's the end game here?
I think it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier in our conversation. The fact that it is so widespread, the fact that you have more than 50 cities protests, and they have no sign of slowing down. Right, the protesters are still in the street
Mhm.
despite all the violence, despite the crackdowns. People are coming out day after day, and the fact that you and I are having this conversation right now, the fact that the international community has its eyes on Iran and is saying, as President Biden said last week, we support the Iranian people.
Mhm.
And we decry what happened to Mahsa Amini. We decry the abuse that she faced by the hands of the morality police. The fact that the international community is involved, and the fact that so many Iranians are involved, may signal that this is a catalyzing moment for
Mhm.
change.
Mhm. What would really, I mean, there's a lot of verbalizing support for the young people in Iran who are standing up to to the government, really. But I wonder what your interpretation of what would be the sort of the best level of support for the young people on the ground. What would you expect from Western nations in terms of support? What would look like rock solid support? Is it the kind of thing we see going on in the Ukraine in terms of lending? What would, in your estimation, amount to really rock solid support for the young people on the ground?
I think one of the biggest challenges right now for folks on the ground is the lack of access to internet and technology, right? And so I think that one of the things we can do outside of Iran is really push for folks to be able to have that, because that is such a key organizing tool. It also helps protesters feel like they're not in the dark, that their voices are being heard. One of the things that so many of us are doing is we're calling friends and family members saying, you're on the news every night. Keep, don't worry. It's happening. But not having access to technology, to the internet, not having internet access, that's a huge deal. And so, one of the things that was incredibly important during the Green Movement of 2009, which got it nicknamed the Twitter Revolution, was when Twitter said, no, we're going to make sure that Twitter is open so folks can use that to organize. So I think efforts like that are things that can certainly help move the needle. In addition, I think we need to think about the impact of sanctions. I know that sanctions are back on the table, but unfortunately, when sanctions happen, it's typically the most vulnerable who are hit the hardest. Yeah. So we have to think about, what our intent is with regards to sanctions and how we can get basic necessities, supplies, and support to the Iranian people who need it most right now.
I wonder as well, why do you think Amini's case broke out when so many others across the years did not? Presumably did not. Like, why is that?
I think it's a combination of things. I think the fact that it was caught on videos is significant. I think the fact that, Mahsa Amini was not an activist as such, right? She was not someone who had been penning essays that critiqued the Islamic Republic. She was someone who was walking in the street with a headscarf that was improperly placed and pants that the morality police deemed too tight. I mean, that is all that she was doing. And so I think that is one of those things, and for her to face such brutality for just walking in the street with a headscarf that was a few millimeters off, and then for her to face such a cruel and violent death. I think that really was a call to not just Iranians, but people around the world that, this is not just a women's or feminist or women's rights issue. This is a human rights issue, which is why we hear the chants on the street. People say women, freedom, life, right? Women, freedom, life. These are all vital components. This is absolutely a human rights issue.
I wonder what democracy would look like. Can the government be brought down? And to what extent would there be a shift in religion? Would democracy in Iran mean less religious rules and regulations? What would democracy look like in Iran?
I think we've had windows of opportunity to engage those conversations. So certainly, as I mentioned, the research I did was under President Khatami, a more reformist president. Prior to the current president, Raisi, we had President Rouhani, and that is someone with whom I think, conversations could have been had about how to implement democracy. But I think one of the most powerful calls that young people make with regards to what kind of government they'd like to see, what they'd like to see, honestly, Sophia, is a government that cares more about unemployment and issues like infrastructure and traffic, schools, than about a headscarf or about hairstyles. And I think that is the most powerful call, is young people saying, be a government that represents us, that has our interests at stake, as opposed to being a government that is so overly focused on the body, on what we wear, on what we do, and who we do it with.
Yeah, it calls to mind, I spent a lot of time in India, and I think when I first arrived, my research was so focused on what economic reforms, what market reforms should look like, right? And then you come to realize that people in South Asia want the very same thing that people in New York or DC or Montana want. We want access to the global economy. And so in many sense, I hear that what they want is what we all want, really.
Yes.
Free. Just to
exactly.
That's
to be free, to be respected, to be seen, to be heard, and to have their voices out there and to have their voices make a difference.
Right. So let's talk a little bit then about what we can expect in terms of future publications. Is there something you're working on? The op-ed was so well received in the Washington Post, and it extends and leans into your earlier works and writings. What are you working on now?
That's a great question, Thane. Thank you. I actually have a book coming out next year called Book of Queens, which is actually documents the history of my grandmother on my father's side and how she engaged using horses, a rare breed of horse called the Caspian horse, the oldest horses, how she helped to smuggle women who were survivors of domestic violence to safety on horseback. So it's sort of part memoir, part history. And interestingly, these same horses that she had trained and bred were the horses that were used by an all-female army in Afghanistan during the War on Terror many years later. So that's one book folks can look forward to. And I'm also working on a book about the underground and the way in which feminist movements in the underground uphold each other and bring about meaningful social change through a transnational feminist alliance.
Yeah. This is fascinating. It sort of leans into what we were talking a little bit about off camera, Layla Ahmed's earlier publication, which I read many moons ago, but I still have it. Layla Ahmed was one of the earlier feminists, really. What is it about her work that you think, what's the legacy of her work in contemporary feminism in Iran today? What would you say?
I think Layla Ahmed's work was incredibly pivotal in opening up a conversation about different kinds of feminism, right? I think for so long we had this notion that feminism is something that is, monolithic, defined by maybe the West, et cetera. And her work on gender and Islam and her work that pointed out, there can be an Islamic feminism opened up a much broader conversation about the different ways in which feminism can be interpreted in a transnational context. And I think she was part of a larger wave of feminist writers, writing, as quote unquote subaltern, writing in response to, how do you create a coalition of feminists that is really transnational? So she was really a catalyzing force in bringing Muslim majority countries and Muslim majority feminists to the table to have these important conversations. And I think one of the things we see today is, these alliances between, women of color feminists in the West and women of color feminists transnationally, that can all be traced back to some of the linkages that Dr. Ahmed writes about.
Right. What do you think Western feminists, this is something I grapple with myself. What do you think Western feminists get right or wrong about feminists in other parts of the world?
I think one of the things that often is eclipsed, and not necessarily intentionally, but this idea that there are many types of feminism outside of the United States, and that something like the issue of the headscarf, that it can be a lightning rod issue with feminists, right? So and that it's about choice, right? It's not about fighting to make sure that no one ever wears a headscarf. It's about fighting to make sure that people have choice, just like it is here in the United States. Right. And so, there are some really strong ties. And I think that it's important that we underscore those. And also, I think that it's important that Western feminists uplift and amplify the voices of non-Western feminists, just like you're doing, today. I think that, making sure that we do that work. Chandra Mohanty has a brilliantly beautiful piece on transnational feminism called Under Western Eyes Revisited. And she makes a passionate call for Western feminists working closely with feminists around the world to amplify their voices and also to show that there can be a solidarity, that these are not silos, that things that affect women in one part of the world affect women across and reverberate across the ocean.
Yeah, Dr. Mohanty is definitely one of my sheroes. So thank you for lifting her voice in this conversation. Now, the last line of your op-ed is no country, no matter how long it tries, can repress its citizens forever. The key point here is forever. What gives you hope that this will change and that this movement around Masha's death is sustainable, is sustained action? It represents a paradigmatic shift in the movement. What gives you hope and how?
I think one of the things that gives me hope are the gains that that the young revolutionaries have already made. They've made significant gains, right? And you've seen so many movements coming out since 2000, right? You had the Green Movement, you had 2014 My Stealthy Freedom, you've had the 1 million signatures campaign, 1 million women signatures. The fact that the movements, even though they face brutality and they face repression at every turn, not only have the movements not died down, but they've actually increased, and people continue to fight, and they're actually having a snowball effect where people around the world are coming together to uplift the voices of these courageous individuals.
Let's talk about the future of the movement. What should advocacy and activism look like as women try to battle what I see as these final hurdles in the movement? Is these sort of there's economic inequality, but this business around gender and women's place seems to be like it's the last thing. What should advocacy and activism look like?
I think advocacy and activism really has to be about partnerships. It has to be about transnational partnerships. It has to be about working together and amplifying the fact that issues around gender and women's bodies, they do affect all of us. Right? They affect every single person. And women facing this brutality in Iran, that's going to have an impact on women throughout the region. And we've actually now seen some more, movements happening in Lebanon and in Syria, right? And so I think the advocacy has to be networked and connected. And it also has to really bring to the table different voices and different perspectives to engage meaningful change.
Perhaps at a turning point in history. We thank you, Pardis Mahdavi, Provost of the University of Montana and author of the book Passionate Uprising, Iran's Sexual Revolution. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that's it for our program today. Remember, you can follow me or the show on Instagram or Twitter. Thank you so much for watching Feminism Today on Free Speech TV. Join us again next week.